My brothers, my sisters, my elders, lean in with me for a moment. There are stories that rise quietly like a soft morning breeze, and there are stories that walk into the room, place their hands upon the table, and shake the dust from the rafters. What happened in Jamaica was not a breeze. It was a trembling, a stirring, a calling out that echoed far beyond the island's shores. Picture the Parliament of Jamaica, polished wood, heavy lights, the weight of old power sitting in every corner. Then imagine this: elders watching from their living rooms, young men listening from workshop radios, grandmothers pausing their evening cooking. Because something unexpected was about to unfold. Something the island had not seen in years. Something that made men sit straighter and made women whisper, "Did they really say that?" out loud. And before we step into that moment together, I invite you, with respect and gratitude, to press subscribe. Not for numbers, not for vanity, but so that every time a story like this rises, you will not miss the truth when it comes knocking. Now walk with me, family, because what those Jamaicans said inside their own parliament changed everything. My brothers, my sisters, my elders, let us return to that morning in Kingston, when the sun rose heavy and golden over the blue mountains, casting long shadows across the capital. People walked as they always walked. Cars moved as they always moved. But in the air, there was a strange stillness, like the island was drawing a deep breath before speaking a truth it had held for far too long. Inside the Parliament of Jamaica, the room was set as it had been for decades. The green benches, the carved wood, the echo of old debates hanging like ghosts above the chamber. Ministers shuffled papers. Advisors whispered. Cameras blinked red, watching, waiting. No one expected the day to be any different. No one imagined that ordinary Jamaicans would soon turn their own parliament upside down with a single sentence that cut through the noise like a blade of light. But family, truth has a habit of arriving uninvited. And that morning, it walked through the doors with a quiet but determined stride. It began with murmurs outside the building. A group of elders had gathered at the gates, grandmothers in bright headscarves, former soldiers with medals glinting under the sun, retired teachers holding worn notebooks, market women clutching their baskets as if they were shields of dignity. They were not shouting. They were not causing chaos. They were simply standing, waiting, holding a message the nation had grown too weary to ignore. Security guards watched them, puzzled. Staff members glanced nervously, but the elders kept standing. And when the doors finally opened for the day's session, those elders did not shout. They did not storm. They simply stepped forward and delivered the line that would travel across the Caribbean like thunder. Traore showed us who you are. Not a chant, not an insult, not a slogan, but a mirror. The room fell still. In Parliament, the speaker paused mid-sentence. A minister fumbled his notes. Reporters froze with their pens in mid-air, because everyone understood what that sentence meant. It did not mention names. It did not accuse anyone directly. But it exposed everything. Every inconsistency. Every broken promise. Every moment Jamaican people had looked at their leaders and quietly wondered, do you stand for us, or do you stand for someone else? The sentence was a stone dropped into a still pond, and the ripples began immediately. Inside the chamber, members looked around in discomfort. A few laughed nervously, pretending the words carried no weight. Others scowled, offended that ordinary citizens would dare draw such a comparison. But behind those reactions was fear that the public had found a new vocabulary. Fear that citizens were using the actions of another leader as a measuring stick. fear that the people were seeing too clearly. Outside, the elders stood with dignity. They did not speak again. They did not push. They did not threaten. They simply let the sentence hang in the air, carried by the wind, carried by memory, carried by a growing hunger for honesty. And that is when the murmuring began inside Jamaica itself. In the hills of St. Andrew, elders listening to the radio said, "Yes, we feel that." In the fishing towns along the coast, men cleaning their nets muttered, "Dem right, man, dem right." In Montego Bay, shopkeepers repeated the line to one another like a proverb. In Spanish Town, youths recorded videos on their phones, repeating the same words with fire in their voices. People had felt the discomfort for years, but now someone had spoken it aloud, spoken it publicly, spoken it directly into the heart of political power. And when the island heard it, the island woke up. The name Traoré was not just a reference to a man, it was a symbol of courage, a symbol of directness, a symbol of refusing foreign pressure, a symbol of standing tall when tallness is costly. And so when Jamaicans said, "Traoré showed us who you are," they were not talking about Burkina Faso alone. They were talking about themselves, about the Jamaica they wanted, the Jamaica they no longer recognized, the Jamaica they hoped might rise again. Family. This was the Ibrahim Traoré moment that startled Jamaican leadership, not because it came from abroad, but because it came from their own people. It was not external criticism, it was internal awakening. Reporters tried to downplay it. Officials tried to ignore it. Commentators tried to twist it. But the people would not let go. For the first time in a long time, Jamaicans were holding up a mirror and asking their leaders to look, really look at the reflection. And if the Parliament of Jamaica felt shaken that morning, it was because the sentence did not attack them. It revealed them. But my elders, remember this. The moment inside Parliament was only the spark. Sparks do not scare governments. Fires do. And what followed next, that was the fire. What happened after that sentence spread across Jamaica would send shockwaves through churches, schools, street corners, and homes until even the Caribbean Sea seemed to carry the echo. My brothers, my sisters, my elders, when that single sentence drifted out of the Parliament building and settled upon the island, something stirred in Jamaica that had been sleeping for a very long time. It did not burst into flames immediately. No. Real change seldom begins with fire. It begins with whispers, with old memories shaking themselves awake, with people asking, quietly at first, "Are we finally ready to speak?" And speak they did. By the second day, radio stations across Kingston were buzzing. Morning call-in shows that usually discussed traffic and weekend football suddenly became confession booths for a nation that had carried too much in silence. "Traoré showed us who you are," callers repeated, not with anger alone, but with a tired honesty that made presenters pause between breaths. A retired soldier from St. Catherine spoke slowly, his voice steady. "We served this country with loyalty. We no ask for much, but when the people stand up, we expect leadership, not excuses." A grandmother from Clarendon said gently, "We raised our children to be brave. Now dem see bravery somewhere else. And dem wonder why we no see it here." Teachers, nurses, bus drivers, ordinary island people all joined the rising chorus. Some laughed bitterly, some cried, some simply sighed, as if the weight of decades had finally slipped from their shoulders. But it was not only the callers. Churches felt it too. Pastors across the island began weaving the moment into their sermons. One preacher in Montego Bay told his congregation, The truth is like a lamp, my people. When you hide it under a bowl, the bowl catches fire. Congregants nodded, clapped, hummed, because they understood. The sentence from Parliament had not created the fire. It had simply revealed the bowl. Soon after, Jamaican youths picked up the message. Videos spread across social media, young men on corner streets speaking with fierce conviction, young women with braided hair stepping forward on camera saying, "We want leaders who stand tall. If another man from another land can walk with dignity, why we scient ask the same from ours?" Their faces were intense, their voices trembling with a mixture of frustration and hope. Even musicians, always the historians of the island's heartbeat, began hinting at the moment in their lyrics. Reggae DJs slipped the sentence between bass lines. Dub poets recited verses in half-lit studios. It was as if the island's rhythm itself had absorbed the message and begun echoing it back. But family, not everyone welcomed this awakening. Inside the political world, discomfort tightened like a cold hand around the throat of the establishment. Commentators on national television spoke with cautious smiles that hid deep unease. One analyst said, "Let us not romanticize foreign leaders," while another whispered, "This comparison is dangerous." Yet for all their warnings, what they feared most was not the comparison itself. It was the fact that Jamaicans, for the first time in years, were comparing. Behind closed doors, meetings grew tense. Advisors scrambled to control the narrative. Some tried to dismiss the growing sentiment as emotionalism. Others attempted to frame it as misunderstanding. But the people, my elders, had found their voice. And once a people find their voice, explanations become weak currency. That is when the reaction spilled beyond Jamaica's borders. Caribbean islands, watching closely, began to echo the same reflections. On talk programs in Trinidad, callers said, "Perhaps we need such honesty here too." In Barbados, social workers asked on air, "Do we still understand service or have we forgotten?" Even in the Bahamas, community elders whispered, "The people are waking up," and not only in Jamaica. The diaspora felt it as well. Across the Atlantic, African communities nodded knowingly. Across North America, African Caribbean families shared the story in group chats. In London, elders in Brixton spoke about it between sips of tea. And in the United States, African American elders, who have seen generations of promises rise and fall, leaned forward and listened more closely than anyone else. For them, this was not just politics. It was recognition. Recognition of a wound, a longing, a dignity that communities across the Black world had been trying to reclaim for generations. And this is where the Ibrahim Traoré reaction began to circulate, not as a speech, not as a document, not as an official response, but as an emotional echo. People were not simply reacting to a leader from Burkina Faso. They were reacting to the idea of leadership that stands unbought, unbent, and unafraid. They were reacting to courage. They were reacting to a man who spoke plainly when plain speech was costly. Leaders fear many things, my elders, but nothing frightens them more than the moment their people begin to compare courage. Because once a nation sees what bravery looks like, pretense becomes harder to sell. And so Jamaica found itself in a storm not of violence, not of chaos, but of clarity. And clarity is the most dangerous storm of all. But hear me now, family. This was not the peak, not yet. For when a society begins questioning its leaders, the real struggle does not happen in Parliament. It happens in the streets, in the schools, in the homes, in the quiet corners where truth takes root. And what happened next? The consequences that swept across the island and into the wider Caribbean would shake far more than the walls of Parliament. My brothers, my sisters, my elders, when truth escapes the walls of a Parliament, it does not tiptoe through society. It moves like water seeping into every crack, every memory, every forgotten conversation. And when Jamaicans spoke that sentence aloud, it was no longer just a comment. It became a mirror too large to hide, too bright to dim, too honest to ignore. Let us walk through what happened next. At first, the reaction seemed simple. Discussions, debates, disagreements. But within days, a deeper shift began to pulse beneath the surface. In the hills of St. Mary, families gathered around evening radios, listening to callers argue passionately about leadership and loyalty. In Spanish Town, shops paused their music and switched to talk stations. Even fishermen along the southern coast left their nets on the sand to hear the next update. Consequences do not always scream. Sometimes they hum like a quiet electric current running beneath society, making everyone more alert, more awake, more aware. And Jamaica, an island shaped by centuries of struggle and resilience, began to hum. Community groups held spontaneous meetings under almond trees and tarpaulin tents. Elders who had long felt ignored suddenly discovered that their voices carried weight again. They spoke about dignity, about history, about the dreams they once had for their island. Their children listened. Their grandchildren listened. Even those who usually turned away from politics found themselves drawn into the conversation. It was not anger alone that moved people. It was longing. Longing for a Jamaica that felt honest again. Longing for leaders who remembered the people who raised them. Longing for a moral compass that did not bend for convenience or approval. Soon, the hum became a pulse. Schools began discussing civic responsibility in classrooms. Teachers encouraged students to think about integrity, courage, accountability. In universities, debates erupted across campuses. Sociology professors used the moment as a case study of collective awakening. Students who had never cared for political debate found themselves suddenly invested. And then came the churches. Sermons across the island shifted in tone. Ministers spoke of truth-telling, of courage, of the duty leaders owe to the weak. Congregations nodded deeply. Because Jamaica's spiritual traditions have always understood that leadership is not about status, it is about service. Youth ministries held open mic evenings where young men and women spoke freely. One young woman said with tears in her eyes, "If we never speak, nothing will change. If we never ask, nobody will answer." Her words were shared across the island within hours, but family, the consequences did not stop with Jamaica alone. Across the Caribbean Sea, other nations began to feel the tremor. In Antigua, callers asked radio hosts whether their own leaders would stand scrutiny. In St. Lucia, social activists held a community discussion titled, "What Do Our People Deserve?" Trinidadian newspapers published editorials reflecting on a regional crisis of trust. Barbados talk shows spoke of a Caribbean crossroads. It was as if the entire region had inhaled the same breath of clarity. Then something even more remarkable happened. Jamaican diaspora communities in Miami, Toronto, London began holding virtual town halls. Elders who migrated in the 1970s and 1980s spoke with unexpected emotion. Many said, "We love where we live now, but Jamaica is still in our bones. We want better for the place that raised us." African Caribbean churches in New York dedicated entire evenings to prayer and reflection about integrity in leadership. Community leaders spoke about Western pressure, post-colonial wounds, and the burden of small nations navigating large powers. The conversation deepened, broadened, thickened. People felt connected across oceans in a way they had not felt for decades. In barbershops across Brooklyn, in hair salons in Atlanta, in living rooms in Houston, African American elders listened closely. Many nodded slowly, saying, "We have seen this pattern too. We know what happens when people finally demand truth. Consequences, my elders, do not always arrive as storms. Sometimes they arrive as awakenings, subtle, steady, spiritual. But awakenings make those in power uncomfortable." Within Jamaica's political sphere, the unease grew sharper. Politicians attempted to redirect the conversation, to dilute the comparisons, to call for calm. Some hosted press conferences urging unity. Others tried to frame the rising concern as misguided emotion. But the people did not retreat. They had tasted clarity, and clarity is a flavor that does not fade easily. Rumors began to swirl about internal disagreements within the political class. Journalists whispered of tense exchanges, of closed-door meetings stretching late into the night. Analysts debated whether this was a temporary moment or the beginning of a generational shift. But the most profound consequence was this: Jamaicans, ordinary, everyday Jamaicans, realized they were not powerless. They realized they could speak. They realized they could question. They realized they could demand better. And nothing frightens an establishment more than a society discovering its own voice. Now, family, before we move forward, let me place a question gently in your hands. A question for your heart, your wisdom, your years. Do you believe Caribbean people are finally stepping into a new season of awakening? One that leaders can no longer silence or ignore. Because what came next would reach far beyond the islands. For the ripple was moving swiftly now, carrying the Caribbean's awakening straight toward the United States, and the world was beginning to pay attention. My brothers, my sisters, my elders, when the Caribbean begins to rise, the tremor does not stop at the water's edge. Oceans may separate nations, but truth travels by its own current. And what began in Jamaica, that whisper turned hum, turned pulse, soon drifted northward, carried by the voices of a people rediscovering themselves. In the United States, African American communities felt the shift before the mainstream even noticed. In barbershops from Detroit to New Orleans, men paused mid-conversation, listening as someone read aloud the words that had shaken Jamaican Parliament. In church halls in Chicago and Baltimore, elders shared the story during midweek fellowship, saying, "Look at our brothers and sisters in the islands, them finding courage again." You see, family, African American elders know the sound of awakening better than most. They have lived through civil rights marches, through broken promises, through moments when truth tried to surface but was pushed down by power. And so, when they heard Jamaicans challenging their own leaders, a familiar vibration stirred in their spirits. Some called it memory, some called it warning, some called it hope. Local radio stations in cities with large Caribbean communities began inviting scholars, pastors, and activists to discuss the moment. One professor from Howard University said on air, "This is not a Jamaican issue alone. This is a diaspora question. What kind of leadership do Black people deserve in the 21st century?" Callers across America nodded, even though they could not be seen. Soon after, major newspapers took cautious note. Journalists tiptoed, describing the situation as a moment of unusual public reflection in Jamaica. But even in their caution, you could sense their discomfort. Western media has never been quick to celebrate the self-awareness of small nations, especially when that awareness reflects poorly on larger powers. Yet the wave could not be denied. It was too widespread, too organic, too human. African scholars in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and Senegal began making quiet observations as well. Online forums lit up with discussions connecting the Caribbean's awakening to broader African calls for dignity and political honesty. The Black world is recalibrating, one historian wrote, and Jamaica has thrown the first stone across the river. Diplomats watched from a distance. Policy analysts whispered behind closed doors. Western governments, who often prefer the Caribbean to remain predictable, sensed the potential implications. For when a people awaken to their own power, they become harder to influence, harder to mold, harder to sway with promises or pressure. Awakening is not only emotional, it is geopolitical. But perhaps the most powerful reaction came from the ordinary African-American citizen. Elders sitting in quiet apartments, sipping evening tea, whispered to themselves, "I know this feeling." Middle-aged workers on night shifts watched clips from Jamaica and murmured, "We have our own questions too." Younger people posted online, reflecting on accountability, calling for a deeper conversation about courage in leadership. The Caribbean did not simply stir America's attention, it reopened America's reflection. And that, my elders, is where the story takes an even more profound turn, because once the United States begins to look, the entire world follows. But the final question remains. After the world has watched Jamaica awaken, what path will the island choose next, and who will walk that road with them? My brothers, my sisters, my elders, when a people awaken, the world often assumes the journey ends with awareness. But awareness is only the beginning. The true test comes after the trembling stops, after the echo fades, after the excitement settles into a quiet room where the next step must be chosen with steady hands and clear minds. Jamaica now stands at such a crossroads. On one side lies the familiar path, the well-worn road of political routine, international dependency, cautious diplomacy, and the gentle acceptance of things as they are. Many nations choose this path because it feels safe, predictable, comfortable. It does not require the courage to challenge, nor the will to build something new. It asks nothing hard from its people, and therefore gives nothing strong in return. But on the other side lies a different road, the narrow path that leads upward. The path of accountability, of clear-eyed leadership, of remembrance of who the island once was and who it still could be. It is a path that requires courage from both leaders and citizens. It demands that the elderly speak with honesty, that the young rise with purpose, that churches, schools, and communities reclaim their role as moral guardians of the nation. The road ahead is not a political question. It is a generational question. Elders in Jamaica, who once walked through the years of independence, know the weight of this moment better than anyone. They remember what hope sounded like when the island first tasted freedom. They remember the music, the unity, the pride, and they also remember how that flame dimmed over the decades, covered by compromise, foreign pressure, internal struggle, and quiet disappointment. Now the flame flickers again, but a flicker is not a fire unless someone protects it. Young Jamaicans, watching this moment unfold, are asking themselves whether they will inherit an island still searching for its identity, or an island ready to stand tall in its own truth. The diaspora watches with equal interest, wondering whether the land of their ancestors is ready to begin a new chapter that honors the sacrifices of the past. And Jamaica's leaders, whether they embrace the moment or resist it, now face a decision that will define their legacy. Will they walk with the people or against the tide? Will they stand with dignity or retreat into excuses? Leadership is measured not in speeches, my elders, but in posture. And right now, the posture of the nation is changing. The road ahead will not be easy. No nation that chooses honesty over comfort finds the journey simple. But every nation that has walked this path has found something priceless at the end of it. Respect, unity, clarity, and the rediscovery of its own spiritual backbone. The question, then, is not whether Jamaica can walk forward. The question is whether Jamaica will choose to. And family, that choice will echo across waters far wider than the Caribbean Sea. For the story of Jamaica's next step is not only Jamaica's story. It is a story that touches America, Africa, and every corner of the Black world, and the ending has not yet been written. My brothers, my sisters, my elders, as we stand at the end of this journey together, let us look back with clear eyes and steady hearts. Something profound happened in Jamaica, something deeper than politics, something older than Parliament itself. An island found its voice again. A people remembered their worth. A nation whispered the kind of truth that can travel across generations and oceans. Jamaicans did not raise their voices out of hatred. They rose out of longing for dignity, longing for courage, longing for leadership that does not tremble when the moment demands strength. And when they said, "Traore showed us who you are," they were not merely speaking to power. They were speaking to themselves. They were saying, "We remember what truth feels like." The ripple of that awakening has traveled far. African American elders felt it. Caribbean communities felt it. African scholars felt it. The Black world felt it. For this was a reminder that every generation, at least once, must confront its own reflection. And yes, family, this reflection carried the weight of the Ibrahim Traoré moment. Not because Jamaicans sought to praise one man, but because they saw in that moment a reminder of what leadership can be when it refuses to bend. They also saw the Ibrahim Traoré reaction, not as a command, but as a symbol of standing upright in a world that often asks small nations to kneel. Jamaica now holds a choice in its hands, a choice between comfort and courage, between silence and honesty, between the soft drift of the old ways and the firm step of a new path. That choice will shape the island's future far more than any speech or headline, and the world is watching. Because the Caribbean has always been more influential than its size suggests. Its spirit has always been larger than its borders. My elders, before we part, let me place one question in your heart. Do you believe Jamaica will take the higher road, even when the higher road is steep? If your answer is yes, then walk with us. If your answer is, "I hope so," then stay close. If your answer is, "I am not sure," then let this be the beginning of your reflection. And now, family, if this message spoke to your spirit, I invite you with gratitude to press subscribe, share this video with another elder, and leave your wisdom in the comments below. For the story is not finished. The awakening is only beginning, and another Ibrahim Traoré moment may already be rising on the horizon.